Greetings, listeners. Puka here. We've begun recording the episodes for release after our summer hiatus ends in a couple of weeks. As that content is being prepped for editing, we present to you today the audio from an interview that Josh and I did recently with Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, wherein we generally discuss Changeling, the World of Darkness, and our podcast. The content has been slightly edited and condensed, in part because my internet, at least, was embarrassingly laggy. We'd like to thank Barney for reaching out to set this up, and we encourage you to check out the vast amount of content he has created through Storycomic, links to which are in the show notes for this minisode. Without further ado, some talking, and theme music. Music and talking.
Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 373. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the internationally renowned and highly creative team behind Changeling the podcast, Joshua Hillerup and Puka G.
Hi.
Hey, guys.
Hello.
How's it going?
Hello.
You said that very high number, and I felt very inadequate as a podcast host. So, thanks for that.
But you know, usually if you make it past 10 episodes, you're good. You just keep going from there. So yeah, and you guys are well past it. You guys are now. That's right, because you have 88.1. I love the fact that you actually had an episode based off of the storyteller screen. That was ingenious.
We weren't going to. It was going to be like patron content, and then someone was like, "No, you should just make it a minisode." I'm like, "It's 7.5 minutes."
It's
of
a
audio.
it's a microsode.
Yeah.
I was so into it, and then it ended because I'm used to you guys having like these long episodes. Some of them are well over an hour, and it's great because where my work is a little over an hour away. So when your episode pops in, I get so excited. Before I get into the car, I have to like open up my phone and then make sure what's being downloaded. And when I see the Changeling the podcast is downloading, I'm like, it's going to be a fun ride. And then I get excited. And then I got super excited because I did one download. I'm like, I didn't even look at the time. It's like, I know it's always good. And I'm driving and I barely just pull out of my town before I hit that road. All of a sudden it ends. I'm like, no, that's all I downloaded. What am I going to do? Talk to us a little bit about, first we want to talk to you all about what is Changeling, because a lot of our listeners are into tabletop role-playing games. They're into children's books, they're into other books, they're into comic books. For those that are just going to learn Changeling now, tell them why Changeling is probably one of the best worlds that's been created in a role-playing game.
Okay, so you're playing the Fae, who are in human bodies now. And it all, I think the core things about it are two concepts called banality and glamour. And I think that this is both key to what Changeling is and key to at least why I love Changeling. And with glamour being like creative impulse or inspiration or romantic concept of sublime almost, if you're familiar with that. And banality's essentially its antithesis. It's the not just boring, but like the irritatingly pointless. The way you feel when you get shut down on something you enjoy because somebody says, "Well, that's dumb." Like
the aggressively humdrum.
Yeah. So it's not just the boring. It's not just like, oh, it happens to be a thing, but because everybody can enjoy. I enjoy a lot of things. Well, people find boring, but that's not. I think of it as also like what you're supposed to do instead of what you want to do, and not just in the practical sense, but in the like you have to do this because that's what it's expected of you kind of thing. It's a game of about mechanicalizing microaggressions and dealing with. Yeah. When I first got into it, I had no idea what I was getting into. And then like once I actually got into it, I'm like, oh, this is just like a game that like puts into mechanics and concepts things I experienced in my own life and didn't have words for. It's like giving me a vocabulary to talk about things I was struggling with and still do. So
my go-to line when I'm trying to get people to play it is, in Changeling, you play a fairy in a human body, and you have this spark of glamour within you, and it's that spark of inspiration that you're trying to both fan into a flame within yourself, but also bring light to others, and the world is constantly trying to stamp it out. And most of the people I say that to are like, I can really relate, because that's a very human experience in a way.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be you're encouraging it. There's all sorts of ways.
It doesn't have to
that.
be.
Yeah, there's also the very mechanicalized fairies who go and make others feel the banality to get something out of it themselves, kind of slam down with ravaging and things like that. And yeah, it's not just a happy thing, but it has the happy stuff, but it also has some darkness, and it's kind of ambiguous a lot of the time as to what's good or bad or dark and light in it.
Right.
Even if that's...
You're struggling to keep your awareness of all of this alive, because eventually you will forget. You will forget your nature, and you will,
It's like, it's both an extremely hopeful game and an incredibly depressing game at the same time.
And so talk to us a little bit about, how did the two of you meet, and how did the two of you decide to start the podcast?
The Changeling fandom isn't massive, like the online fandom of people talk about Changeling. So we were both in that pretty early on. So we were seeing each other on forums and things like that for decades, I think. But I think what led to the podcast was sort of two pieces. There was Walking Away from Arcadia, which very good Changing the Dreaming podcast, but that was like very focused in a certain way, and it was, I don't know if it was intended to last indefinitely, but it didn't. It felt more like one of those art projects that has like a specific duration and it's ended. Right. It was like winding up. And there was also Mage the podcast, which was named after Werewolf the podcast. And both Puka and I, we were on the Mage the podcast Discord. And I think around the same time, we both independently went, we should do both of us thought to do a Changeling the podcast. I don't know if the name specifically, but we're thinking we should do a pod. I was thinking I should do a podcast. You're thinking you should do a podcast, and
I think you expressed it publicly first.
Yes, and I was we were both planning on it, right? So when we went, okay, that it'd be silly for us both to do competing Changeling the Dreaming podcasts at the same time, and we hashed out some stuff and figured out. Had you ever been on a podcast before, Puka? Because I certainly hadn't.
No, I don't think I done streaming games and sort of other stuff within the community, but never a podcast.
Yeah, I listened to a lot of podcasts, but I never did it. And this was during the pandemic too, so it's parasocial. Yeah. It's my
Mage the podcast was my first podcast that I listened to regularly and got involved in the community. There were other ones I had listened to off and on, but that was what drew me into the world of podcasting. And it was lockdown, and it was what else are we going to be doing?
When you're doing a podcast with somebody else, it's almost, you kind of have to take on a character. Someone's going to be the curiosity, one's going to be the content expert, but the two of you kind of share those roles in a way as well, because you both talk to us about how this works with how you guys decide on what you're going to talk about, and then how do you decide who's going to decide who's going to talk about what.
Puka's done a lot of that, so you've been doing a lot of the I've been kind of the knocker of it, and you've been the pisky issue type of it.
Yeah, I think we just we talked about what was needed at the start, and I think just kind of tried things out and then stuck with them. I think early on, I was kind of okay, I'll do the editing. Josh handles a lot more the back end stuff, and I think you probably do a lot more community engagement than I do. I'm I don't have time to talk to people. But yeah, otherwise, I think when we have ideas for episodes and we start making our schedules in advance, and we think okay, well, we know we want to talk about this. What are the main points we want to hit? And we just kind of talk about, let's talk about this. Let's not bother with this. And then record with our respective points of view.
And so also, Puka, you've put out a lot of stuff in the Storyteller's Vault as well. So you've actually write some Changeling supplements.
Mage was the first game that I put something out there for. And it was something that I had wanted to do for a long time. And through the Mage the Podcast Discord, people were encouraging and said, yeah, you should go just upload something and see how it goes. And if it goes well, do another one. And now, like 13 titles later, here I am. So,
What have the two of you learned about the game as you've created the podcast?
I have had so many misconceptions about it in my head. Just going through and reading, like beforehand, okay, if I'm going to run a game, I'm going to pick up a book and figure out what I need to know to run the game from this or something like that, right? But when you're going to talk about the book, it's a lot more in depth, and there's a lot of things I just didn't get, or maybe I hadn't read this since 1998 or something. So I don't know, there's a lot of stuff about what the book actually says, like my opinions on the books have changed a lot.
I don't want to say misconceptions necessarily, but things that I had either forgotten, they were lost in the mists, or I had just never noticed when I read through the first time. But maybe more importantly, through engaging with people around the topics and talking on the Discord about these things, learning how much variation there is in how people understand the game, not just the particulars of the rules and like, well, this contradicts this, so which thing should we go for? But what people read into glamour and banality, for example. Like, there's 10 different definitions or expressions of each throughout the canon, right from the start up until the last book. And the way people, if you say, give me a one-sentence description of those two things, they're going to draw on the same exact words but come up with something completely different. And to me, that really shows how open of a world it has been and still is for a lot of people.
Yeah. I do like that in Changeling. Okay, maybe there's some things that couldn't be held in the same chronicle, but you can have it like, let's explore what glamour means in this session, and then in the next session can be very different. And it's still talking about glamour, but it's not the same thing at all.
And just to reference for our listeners and our viewers out there, it's like another good way people would describe Changeling is like, it's like the World of Darkness system meets Dungeons and Dragons meets a Neil Gaiman novel. Basically, it's thrown in all thinking about folks that play Dungeons and Dragons. If you want to fight a dragon in a world like ours, and you love rolling a bunch of dice, then this is probably the best game for you.
Yeah, and like you can have literal dungeons very easily. Just quite a few basements would just become dungeons because there's this sort of chimerical versus mundane side to things, the world.
Yeah, it's like it overlaps on itself.
Yeah,
like you have the dreaming kind of overlaps onto the real world.
Or it's two reflections of the same thing. It's hard to.
Right, and that's what I love about it. Yeah. It's so how you imagine it. I wanted to talk to you two about, because you brought up another couple things that I'm very thankful for with your podcast is standardizing the way to pronounce things. That's pretty good. Like there's always like, I'm driving, I'm like, I didn't know that's how you said that, but that makes sense. Like I always said the Gildu, but that's not how you say it. How is it, Puka?
Hillerup.
You see, like it's you're giving it the.
That's all Puka. That's Puka's the linguist plus.
But I'm not gonna languages. I'm not gonna stop anyone from saying Gillidu. Like that's fine. I do resent some of the pronunciation guides that they've had in the books before, but I'm a language nerd, and so I try to look into the etymologies of these things and find out in the original language how it's pronounced.
And what I love, and you brought this up when you're going over the 20th anniversary edition, is when the books, and this kind of goes for all the other 20th anniversary editions that Onyx Path, kind of put out, is that the folks that wrote these, they were in their 20s, and now they're in their 40s, and they've kind of taken this step back by saying things like, well, the technocracy is just a different kind of, they're not bad anymore. Like they're just, and also with like, and it's just like, cause it's like, it's like.
Well, also, yeah, the one of the big things for the 20th anniversary edition was beforehand, it was like, you hit 25 and you're pretty much guaranteed to enter Grump stage. And it's like, your time as a changeling is, and now all the people who wrote that are well beyond that age.
Right.
Maybe we should let this game be able to be played, you're in your 40s or 60s or whatever.
Jackie Quesada and Nicky Rea, who I think of as the grand dames of Changeling, like they were in their, I think, 40s when they wrote first edition or when they were involved with it. So in terms of exceptions that prove the rule, they've been there from the start. I have to wonder how they felt about that aspect.
Right. So my next question for all of you is like, what are some of the other things that you feel as though the evolution of the game has gotten right, and what are some of the things that just kind of veered off and it's making you scratch your head?
Well, we did an episode shortly before hiatus that was changes in the 20th anniversary edition core book in particular.
I love that one. Yeah.
We got a lot out of us that we needed to in that episode in terms of things we liked and didn't like in that book. But I would say overall, something that I've noticed, not just Changeling, but the World of Darkness at large and in the fan bases as well, I think that people feel that the older games are very confining in a way that they never felt to me. And it just kind of shows culturally how the gaming space has shifted in the last 20 years. Like what people expect to get out of games now is much more person-driven, much more customizable, much more, all of that baked in from the start. It's not that Changeling never had those things. It's just you kind of had to do more of the lifting yourself. And ultimately, I think the earlier games were less individualistic in a way. It was much more emphasis on things like family and society and your found family in particular, your kin group, your kith. And now people are like, well, I want to have an issue with Dragon Wings, who is also this unique thing. And it's not that it's a bad thing necessarily, but it's a shift that to me has been noticeable.
Yeah, like that happened in the early 2000s, really. Like when Dark Ages Fae came out, that was much more on that. And Changeling the Lost, like these were all in the first decade of the 21st century.
Once streaming ended, that shift was underway. And then when we came back to dreaming, it was already complete. So it was a little jarring.
What do you think the writers for Changeling 20th was able to take from Dark Ages Fae, Changeling the Lost, and also the Exalted Fairfolk?
The arts are some big ones for that. So we get these seasonal arts, which are not the same as the Dominions, but there's definitely an inspiration there, I think. There's the contracts art, and I mean, that's what the magic powers are lost is called contracts. And there's something I came across recently in the C20 book I didn't realize that was in what was the fourth novel called? Do you remember?
Cup of Dreams.
Yeah, Cup of Dreams, where they're like summoning things out of the air, like in Exalted the Fairfolk. Like that's in the C20 core book. You could do that with chimerical. You could sort of make chimerical items now. Like that.
There's unleashings too.
Unleashings too, yeah.
What about you, Puka? What are some of the things that you can think of?
I will toot my own horn and say something I've tried to write, and I know other people have tried to write, is breaking away from Seelie, Unseelie as being the only court divisions that are like possible. So with Lost and Dark Ages both, you had the seasonal courts, and a lot of people have worked with that or kind of gone in other directions. I think there's been a lot more separation of the different axes of character creation. So it was kind of like when you were creating a character in the old versions of Changeling, if you made a red cap, they would probably be Unseelie, they probably wouldn't be a noble, they probably have this and that. And now all of those choices, I feel like people approach much more separately, which I think is an artifact of Lost, which has a lot more mixing possibilities. Fairfolk, I admit that when we did our episode on it, that was my first time sitting and reading it through all the way. So Josh can probably speak to the Exalted side better.
I would say Fairfolk, the direction, it's actually in the other direction more. Like Fairfolk was definitely inspired by Changeling. I don't think Changeling as much has been, besides that one thing I brought up, I'm not even sure if that came from the same thing. I don't know how much influence Exalted the Fairfolk and Graceful Wicked Mass had on Changeling the Dreaming 20th Anniversary Edition. Like there's no writer cross-pollination and things like that. So
maybe in part because Exalted did eventually diverge from its prehistory of the World of Darkness identity.
Yeah.
So but Dark Ages Fae too, I know that writers for C20 have said, yes, we did intend to have that be like under the surface, like there's Easter eggs within the core book that refer back to it.
for those that are listening, think, hey, you know what? I might give this game a try. And they want to pick a villain, like a really just like when you're thinking about Changeling 101 villains, would you throw in a Dauntain or a Thalane out the gate? Which ones do you think are probably more easier to grasp for someone who's running a game?
Well, Thalane are easier to figure out. They're just evil.
It might still. I think it's still pretty easy to grasp throwing in an Autumn person. Maybe that wouldn't be your first villain. That'd be like your second storyline, doing that one. But
that would be like your beginning of the first session villain, who's just like an everyday problem that you have to deal with, and not the big bad.
Or the B plot villain.
Yeah. One of the things with Changeling, one of the main themes to me is balancing your Fae side and your human side. Like, you can't go totally into fantasy land because you will lose yourself and disappear into the dreaming, and that's bad. At the same time, you can't totally go into your human side because then you will forget your Fae nature, and that's also bad. So it is very much a game about balance. And the Dauntain are interesting to me because in many ways, and I'm primarily talking about pre-C20 Dauntain here, because that's one of the changes that I think both Josh and I dislike. The way that they are presented, they are balanced, but in a dark way, in a destructive and almost inverse way. Yeah, they have both banality and glamour, but they use it to ends that are corrosive for other changelings. That to me is an interesting villain.
Yeah, it's not balanced so much as the imbalances cancel out with a Dauntain. Like,
maybe that's
He's describing it. Like, I think Autumn people described it like trying to explain the Dauntain, where like a bit of bedlam keeps them from forgetting, kind of like from falling to banality. So
yeah.
And so how do you feel like the C20 kind of adapted from the Time of Judgment, where they basically said, all right, everything's ending, and now they kind of created this evanescence and all that. How do you think that the writers kind of pushed the White Wolf, the World of Darkness mythos past the 2000s?
That one's very strange because so the 20th anniversary lines, like Vampire, that Wraith came out after, but that was the Wraith Curse. It had to come out later. I think it came out. But all those games kind of stuck with not the actual Time of Judgment books, but like the lead all the way from like the Week of Nightmares, which was actually a second edition thing. Mage made it optional, but kind of still implied that's like your default as it had happened. And Changeling just rewrote that, which is interesting. And they made it like other things like 9/11 was like the big event as opposed to dropping a spirit nuke on.
Yeah.
There's some stuff that was just handled strangely, and you could maybe keep it and expand upon it in a way that could have made it less ick, but they didn't write that.
Choices were made.
Right? Yeah, there's definitely some choices made at that time.
Right. How do you feel as though that the writers have been able to adjust the interaction to being, creating in a attempting to or being succeeding at that way? I want to working towards making sure Changeling was a multicultural game, because in the first edition it was pretty westernized kits and everything else just seemed quote unquote different than that. And so I know that they've done a lot with Nunahe. Is that how you say it right? Nunahe?
Nunahe, I think.
Nunahe, and then doing things with like the Land of 10,000 Dreams. Like when that book came out, they're just. So how do you feel that the game has evolved to embrace other cultures and other backgrounds?
With best intentions. I mean, again, this is one of the things that people point to and say, oh, Changeling has always been. I mean, some people outright say it's always been so racist, and some people say it's always been so appropriative. But again, I don't think the developers of the game ever intended to say, this is the boundaries and you can't go outside them. And when they did attempt to bring things in, they did the best they could as 20-somethings living in Georgia before the widespread availability of the internet. But within the fandom, I mean, for years, people knowledgeable in different cultures have developed their own sort of stuff for the game out of their knowledge. So I think the 20th anniversary made a good faith effort to both involve those people and open themselves up to that kind of knowledge with mixed results.
Yeah, and like especially the player's guide, which we haven't done yet.
Yeah.
But because before then it was mostly just the core book, which was just distilling in things from supplements that were already in previous editions. But
yeah,
the player's guide was the new stuff, and there's a big chapter on around the world, and I'm not from these other cultures, so I've heard some people not liking them from those cultures, but I don't really know enough to say to what extent there was good or bad. Like, I know there was definitely not great stuff, but nothing, if you read them not understanding those cultures, you're not going to say, oh, this is like a caricature, or this is portraying someone terrible or falling to the normal stereotypes. It seems like they're at least describing people that make perfectly good PCs. But
do you see this from the perspective of that there literally is going to be no end to different kits that they can create now, especially since they actually have a section on there where it actually says you can invent your own. From a storyteller perspective, how quickly would you recommend opening up that door?
Depends on the storyteller, I would say. I think that you have to allow for the possibility of the existing ones before jumping into it. Like they say in that section, really don't create one unless you're trying to fill a need that the other kits do not fulfill. And you may feel that if you're from a culture where your myths are not represented in the game and you think that they're at an intersection of ideas that isn't in the core kits or whatever, by all means go for it. But a lot of players are just like, well, I want to make a dragon kith. And you can make a dragon for an existing one. It's not that hard.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the tension between, because the sort of core kiths, and you could debate over what are the core kiths, but those are very archetypical. Yeah. Like if you go back when I first got into Changeling, we had friends, and like usually you do the game of like, oh, what kith are you? What kith is this character on this show? What kith is, and you usually have an answer, and it's usually one of the core kiths, like personality wise and things like that. Yeah. So that's not always
how it happened. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I got a knocker. Not like in Changeling spaces, I'll use like a knocker icon because like that's basically me. Even though I'm absolutely rubbish at building physical things, but or fixing them, I'm much more.
We also came of age during the era of like internet personality tests, so I think we're just kind of wired to be ready for those kinds of.
But I think they work that way, like so you can definitely play that, but yeah, there's over in just if you take C20 core book and C20 player's guide, between them there's like 132 kits or something. So
something.
Like if when I went to someone said we're going to play this game, and they're like, no.
And this is part of the thing is like the nature of the 20th anniversary, and the nature of Changeling just never getting enough word count for what it needs. Like, I can think of an alternate reality where you had like a tight, good core book, and then like 5 supplements covering everything that's in the C20 core book, expanding it, and then doing also extra things on top of that, and not all jammed into one chapter.
There's still more books, as you said. That the core of Changeling the podcast is that you have been kind of going over some of the produced and some of the published works have been coming out, and there's still more books. Are you going to also do a lot more books that are going to be available on Drive Through RPG and stuff like that? Or
so I think the tentative plan at this point, the only Changeling the Dreaming official book that's left is the Player's Guide. It is a massive, dense tome, so we're going to break that into 3, but then that's the end of Dreaming. So we have a few more things to kind of like round out the rest of this season. Next year, the plan is to, I don't know if Josh is going to be involved in these episodes or not, but I'm planning to do deep reads of Lost. We do have a lot of Storytellers Vault content that we're both involved with producing.
I'm going to get one out eventually. I have like
Yeah.
20 of them on the go. I just need one of them is just ready for doing like layout and stuff. I need to do that, but yeah.
So if people want to learn more about your podcast, where's the best place they could go to?
They can go to changelingthepodcast.com. They can follow us on Facebook for Changeling the Podcast. We have a YouTube channel for Changeling the Podcast. If you're on Mastodon, you can find us Changeling Pod at dice.camp. And
email? Do you say email?
Email. Yeah, email's podcast at changelingthepodcast.com. And we have our Discord server, discord.me/CTP.
Yeah, so this is, like I say, I've been a huge fan of your. I loved when you talked about, the Arcadia the Wild Hunt. I loved that episode. I still, to this day, I'm wondering if they're doing what like Star Wars canon did, where saying all that stuff was like some of the stuff they didn't say was canon. They said that was considered just like stories in the Star Wars universe. The two of you, would you say Arcadia the Wild Hunt is Changeling canon, or is it not?
I have my answer. But
I have an opinion on canon, where I think for Changeling the Dreaming, and some other World of Darkness and other things too, but it's definitely in Changeling the Dreaming, viewing canon in that way, I think you should look at it as like a literary canon. What are the important works, not what is the orthodox description of the game as opposed to heterodox. I think the whole game's heterodox, so don't.
Yeah. And my take is the card game I think takes place entirely in the dreaming. So it's like, yeah, it's canon because the dreaming's infinite and contains multitudes. So who's going to contradict you?
Yeah.
Any final thoughts for our listeners?
If you're interested, give it a try, because it doesn't, I hope, sound too grandiose to say that Changeling saved my life in some small way as a youth. And I think that it's been really gratifying to see how many people have arrived at the game with the 20th anniversary edition, when so many of us who had the first and second thought, like, it is dead, it is, we're still passionate about it, but no one else is ever going to play this. And there's been such a surge of people who have discovered it. It's like William Carlos Williams said, people die every day for lack of what is found there. So I try to evangelize it as much as I can.
Yeah, right. And this Drive-Thru RPG, if you're talking about the official books, those are all there. You can buy the PDFs. You can buy print-on-demand copies, which hold up better than the 90s printing World of Darkness books anyway. So, and you could do that. And then there's tons of Storyteller Vault content. There's new stuff coming out all the time. And it's, like the game's not dead. And it kind of never will be at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Josh and Puka. This has been a great conversation. I'm so glad we're able to talk.
For sure. Thank you.
Here come the outtakes.
Yeah.
Sorry that I keep glancing off camera because a cat is playing with my toes. I apologize.
Yeah.